I would like to explain the fundamental workings of the European Union with this slide, which I compare to a cycle wheel with 3 circles. In the first outer circle of the tower are the flags of the 28, now 27, member states, which keep control over an average 70% of their own affairs, independently of what happens at the European level, under the principle called subsidiarity. The second circle, the European Council, brings together the government heads of the member states, similar to a presidential system, that look after their sovereignty. It's the institution that has the most political authority. It's these presidents who set the strategy, the main guidelines, and the priorities of the EU, and decide on the treaties to be established. It's the mode of working called intergovernmental. It's these presidents in the European Council who have the main role in appointing the European government, namely the European Commission and its commissionaires in the third circle. The commissioners, however, once appointed by each member state, must remain independent of their original country and look after the general interest of the whole of the EU. The Commission has an administration which, like other governments, is not elected. It's the mode of working called community. So to summarize, we have the first circle with member states looking after their own affairs, namely subsidiarity. The second circle with its presidents looking after their sovereignty, namely the intergovernmental. And the third circle, the European Commission, looking after the general interests of the whole of the EU, namely the community approach. The European Parliament, bottom right, comprises directly elected citizens of Parliament from each member state and represents the European citizens. The Council of Ministers, bottom left, called the Council, comprises government ministers from each member state and is similar to a Senate, but with much more powers, because it's formed from the remainder of the government of each member state. Thus, the head of government is positioned at the European Council in the second circle, and his or her ministers in the Council of Ministers. This body looks after the interests of the member states. I've added the other major institutions, top right, namely the European Central Bank, managing the Eurozone, the European Court of Justice based in Luxembourg, which oversees the respect of the treaties and norms, which should not be confused with the European Court of Human Rights based in Strasbourg, which is independent of the EU, and the Court of Auditors. The first thing that can strike one looking at this organizational structure is the obvious tension between the heads of government of member states looking after their sovereignty in the second circle, the intergovernmental, and the Commission with its community vision of looking after the general interest of the whole of the EU. To help us understand this organizational structure, we need to understand that it's originated from a supranational model conceived by France in 1950 for the European Coal and Steel Community, and this model was used at the beginning of the European project in the Treaty of Rome in 1957. There were 6 instead of 28 countries in the first outer circle. A high authority in the centre, just like the European Commission today, looking after the general interest with its supranational community approach. There was a parliamentary assembly, like the European Parliament today, but purely consultative, a council like the current Council of Ministers. But a major point, there was no Council of Heads of Government. It's the creation of the second circle of the European Council of Heads of Government in 1974, and citizens directly electing their European Parliament in 1979, which fundamentally changed the functioning of the EU and explains the current organization here. Let's have an overview to understand how laws are decided. We've already mentioned that it's the heads of government of member states, the presidents, in the second circle, who set the direction, the priorities, the impetus for the EU. Then the European Commission prepares and submits proposals, and I stress the word proposals and not decisions, because decisions are made by the governments of member states within the Council of Ministers, together with the European Parliament, for almost all laws, that is, the legislative process, as per a normal democracy. But the Council of Ministers retains certain sovereign areas for itself, independently from the European Parliament. For instance, direct taxation and the management of the euro within the Eurogroup. Thus, the management of the Greek crisis was not co-decided with the European Parliament. Let's look at a slide giving an overview as to what in reality the EU deals with. Starting bottom right, here are the various member states with their political powers in numerous areas. It's the member states which decide which powers, which building stones they wish to use to build the European edifice, the main one being its bedrock, its values. The pillars of the Parthenon represent the main areas that the EU deals with. The first pillar representing the single market with its norms and rules to stop, for instance, internal protectionism, which gives a framework within which member states are responsible for making a success or not of their affairs, and where the European Commission works in particular on agriculture and fishing matters. The second column is for the Eurozone, which offers a framework similar to the single market. The third pillar represents cohesion funds that are redistributed to poorer countries and areas to help reduce differences in wealth. The fourth pillar, the EU in the world, with its embryo of a foreign affairs ministry and international aid. And the last column, various, for instance, parts of defence, penal policy, migrations. The small blue circle top right shows the European Commission, which manages and administers the edifice, and to whom the member states gave the thankless task of preparing its norms and regulations. A point that I like to stress is that member states remain in full control of their decisions, especially their receipts and public expenditure, so they only share a part of their powers. For instance, a minimum of social rights, such as the 48-hour week. Member states within the Eurozone also remain in control of their decisions on the economy, their taxes, their public expenditure, retirement rules, etc., but again within the limits of the rules for the Eurozone. Member states can choose to progress further and share more of their sovereign powers, such as defence, direct taxation, social policy, health policy, penal policy, but need to decide unanimously to do so. So one can see in this picture that member states decide by treaty which powers they wish to be handled at the European Union level, and they remain mostly limited to a few key areas. Let's look in further detail into these powers called competencies, which are decided at the EU level. This subject is covered by the Treaty of Lisbon, which sets the rules, which is the Bible of its functioning. Please note that Article 5 of the Lisbon Treaty states that the Union shall act only within the limits of the competencies conferred upon it by the member states in the treaties. Otherwise, competencies remain within member states, so the idea that the EU can decide on everything is completely false. There are three categories of competencies. An exclusive competence, when member states have decided to transfer the whole of their powers, their competencies in an area, such that member states can no longer legislate in their home countries, but everything must be decided at the EU level. There are few exclusive competencies, for instance, the common commercial policy, competition, or the management of the euro. A shared competence. Here, member states have only transferred a part of their competence, such that they can continue to legislate alongside the EU. It's the most common case. The EU then acts in place of a member state when a joint action is considered more effective than member states acting separately. For example, transport. A supporting competence. When the main competence remains with the member states, that is, the EU supports, coordinates, or supplements the actions of member states, such as research, but it's entirely the decision of the member state to participate or not. To summarize, the EU only acts in those areas agreed upon by member states.